I think Israel is probably going to make a decision about striking Iran's nuclear program here in the next few weeks. They're never going to be weaker than they are right now. So that's a factor that's out there. I think Israel recognizes, and I think the United States does too, that now is the time actually to try to extract significant concessions from Iran. Concessions about the scope and scale of their nuclear program, concessions about their avowed policy of destruction of the state of Israel, concessions about their continued support for proxy forces across the region. If we are unable to bring effective pressure on Iran now and cause their course to change, then we're never going to be able to do it.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening. I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. As always, we're joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, as we explore global and national security issues. Today, we're going to discuss the recent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, as well as the current Israeli operation into the West Bank town of Jenin. Well, welcome back, General.
Always good to be here with you, Tad.
So let's start off first. How did we get this ceasefire between Israel and Hamas after over 15 months of fighting?
Well, I think Israel badly wants to get their hostages back. This is an opportunity to do that. Hamas badly needs a pause in the fighting in order to try to reconstitute. So as usual, when there's a conflict, when both parties see some advantage, you have the opportunity to create an agreement. I don't know how long this is going to last. It is, as you know, a three-phase process. We're just beginning the first phase. 3 Israeli hostages have been returned. Some more are going to be returned here over the next few days, which will take us through the first phase. Some few hundreds of Palestinians have, well, not few hundreds, but some Palestinians have been returned in exchange for that. Fighting is supposed to stop. It's a very tenuous way forward, and I will be frankly surprised if the truce holds in its current form.
Right, because we already have Israeli operations in the West Bank. That's not covered in the truce, but there's some Israeli operations in the town of Jenin in the West Bank. Do you think that could jeopardize the peace for the Hamas?
The whole is a sum of its parts, so operations anywhere could certainly affect that. But actually, no, I don't think that will necessarily affect that truce. I do not.
Okay, and then what role did the U.S. play in these truces? Did we see the U.S. putting pressure from the last administration?
I think, and all I know is what I read in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I think we certainly have put continued pressure on Israel to accept these terms. These are largely the same terms that were offered many months ago by President Biden. I think the imminence of President Trump coming into power was the forcing function that allowed this to happen. So if I were going to say, why did it happen now? I would say the Israelis wanted to get this done as Trump came into office.
What's the concern with, or the idea that President Trump's going to change the dynamics?
I think they want to have a good long-term relationship with President Trump. Clearly, President Trump wanted some form of a hostage deal. He got it on the day he came into office. A very important win for him. I think it now gives Israel some leverage as they continue to negotiate with the Trump team about the way forward.
Right, and does that relationship continue to grow? Obviously, in Trump's first administration, he worked pretty pro-Israel with a lot of his policies. Do you think that will continue now?
I think it will. I think going back to President Trump's time in office, he was very supportive of Israel. As you know, Tad, he's responsible for bringing Israel into the Central Command region. That was a Trump decision right before he left office, a decision that has looked very prescient now in hindsight. It has allowed us to do a number of things with Israel that we would not have been otherwise able to do. So I think that was a very important decision. So I think his policy is generally going to be supportive of Israel as we go forward.
So, right. And as Israel continues with the ceasefire, and you said about Hamas possibly reconstituting, is that a concern? I know a number of Israeli legislators have brought it up as an issue. What happens if they start to rebuild?
So these are problems that we identified at the very beginning of this campaign. And what has happened after over a year of intense fighting is Hamas has been defeated. It has not been destroyed. Their political echelon has been decimated. Their military leadership echelon has been decimated, but it still exists. And Hamas is going to be able to regain ground in the territory as Israel withdraws. So this is nothing more than a short-term solution. This is not a long-term solution. Now, we may see negotiations in phase 2 that lead to some form of other organizations coming in to assume control of the territory. in phase 3, and that would be, I think, the best possible thing that could happen. As you know, there are a number of proposals out there for that to happen, and I think that's what we should aim for. But it's far from clear that that's going to happen.
Even if we go through all 3 steps of this current ceasefire and we achieve some sort of medium-term peace, what's that going to look like for Gaza, even if it's under a multinational peacekeeping force or something like that?
Well, if it's under a multinational peacekeeping force and we're able to assert control through that mechanism, then I think the future for Gaza is brighter than if Hamas is left in control of Gaza.
Sure, yeah.
Hamas knows only one thing: death and fighting Israel. They have no positive plan for going forward. A multinational force with the backing of neighbors in the region would actually give opportunity to the people of Gaza to see some way to a future.
Right. But one other thing to consider, and a number of reports in the Wilson Center, others have published on it. They're saying, you could have this a multinational force, but it would be a long time coming in the sense that they'd have to stay there to rebuild Gaza. I mean, it's very, very much destroyed.
This is a long-term project. This is an expensive project. The money is there, and what's the alternative?
Right.
I think we have to accept that. But I think the possibility is there to go forward. I think we have a framework to do it. And we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens in negotiations as we interface, as we get out of phase 1 and go into phase 2.
Right. And see how it holds. What's going to happen with the rest of the hostages, do you think? So, like you said, 3 hostages were released. Or do you think Hamas is going to continue to use that political leverage?
It's going to be very hard for Hamas to give up the remaining hostages because they know once they've given them up, they've given up their trump card, their asymmetric advantage over Israel because of Israel's concern about getting their citizens back. So Hamas will reluctantly give up those hostages and try to extract maximum concessions for Israel in everything that they do. And that will be a large political lift for any Israeli government going forward.
About getting them all back, or
about continuing the negotiations, holding a government together as you try to get those hostages back, because there are going to be a lot of people with very different opinions across the political spectrum in Israel on that.
And speaking of holding the government together, the IDF chief just resigned effective in March. What's that signal from the Israeli government, if anything?
Well, so it's difficult to know how, if he was prompted or he'd been he decided to resign on himself. There's also speculation out there that it reflects the IDF's concern about the next phase of this operation, and that his resignation is somehow linked to that. I don't know the answer to that. Right. I just know that there's a lot of variables as we go forward.
And is that part of the calculation, and Netanyahu has to move going forward and keeping Israel united in a sense and keeping his government in power?
I think it's very much the case. Hamas, on the other hand, is a pure terrorist organization. They have no concern about a constituency, and they've got a very narrow objective: the destruction of the state of Israel. So it's a lot easier to understand and the machinations and the problems that a society like Israel has, as opposed to a terrorist organization like Hamas, who's sitting on the other side of the table.
Well, with that in mind, what are the other? So obviously Israel's dealing with Hamas, still having some operations in the West Bank. Are there any other threats that Israel's worried about now, 15 months after this attack?
Well, I think across the region, Israel has had remarkable success in Lebanon, decapitating and removing a Hezbollah threat that I frankly viewed as perhaps the most significant threat to Israel. They have had remarkable military success in doing that. The threat hasn't gone away, but it's been significantly reduced. So that's a win for Israel. That's a big win for Israel. The collapse of Syria, yet to see how that's going to play out. But an intractable enemy of Israel is now living in a dacha outside Moscow somewhere. And Israel has moved in to establish a buffer zone in the Golan going forward. Remains to be seen how that's going to work out. But Iran is gravely weakened in Syria. Iran is gravely weakened in Lebanon. And that leads me to the last opponent, Iran, which is on its heels and is as bad a place as Iran has been in many decades. So Israel has had some remarkable successes over the past few months. Probably the thing that is most concerning to them is actually what's going on in Gaza because of the importance of the hostages.
And that's where they're getting the most political pressure from the constituencies and citizens? Or what about
Absolutely. I think there's great concern about getting their hostages back. That's understandable. It would be the same in the United States. We've seen the same emotions play out in our country when hostages are held. Unfortunately, terrorist organizations like Hamas are going to draw the lesson from this, that hostages are the way to inflict change on the region. So I think we're going to see much more attention to hostage taking as we go forward.
That's going to be difficult, obviously, for the powers in the region, and
that's why they like it.
Right. And it's difficult to stop. It's hard to stop every single attack.
It's very difficult to stop. You have to be perfect all the time. Your opponent only has to be perfect once. He can fail 9 times, but if he's successful once, that success is all out of proportion.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's this mean for let's say, the Israeli government and the Israeli military? First, the government and its citizens. Are we seeing some conflict fatigue from them?
I think we're certainly seeing conflict fatigue in relation to Gaza, and we're seeing concern again about finding a way to finish it, which we don't yet know how that's going to shake out. On the other hand, as we've noted, they've had remarkable successes.
Right.
Successes in Lebanon, the collapse of Syria, and a profoundly successful campaign against Iran.
So they're seeing success, and that helps kind of keep people motivated.
Success always helps, but I go back to the hostages. In an open and free society, hostages can exert a weight far out of proportion to their number.
Sure, absolutely. And then also going back to our earlier point about the long game, what's that going to look like in Gaza? Because Israel's had plenty of occupation time there that was not particularly successful.
I would just say, Ted, there are options out there that would put other forces on the ground in Gaza. That's probably the best solution going forward. That's a big lift. It's a big lift internationally, and it's an even bigger lift inside Israel. I don't see any other way to do it.
Yeah, other than that multinational peacekeeping force of some sort.
Multinational peacekeeping force of some kind. And unfortunately, Ted, probably the United States is to some degree going to have to be part of that.
Right. It's the only one that can make it happen.
We have unique capabilities, and we remain the indispensable nation.
Speaking of the peacekeeping force or military, how is the Israeli military holding up from your assessment? So after 15 months of combat, the reserves have been called up. Are they seeing some fatigue within their ranks?
Combat of that nature in a built-up area has a significant impact on the force. It chews up casualties. It chews up junior leaders, because that's the only way you can fight that. Technological advantages are minimized. So that's had an effect on the Israeli army and the Israeli Defense Force. On the other hand, their successes in Lebanon, their successes against Iran, speak to the sparkling technological virtuosity of the IDF. And so there's good and bad there. I think they certainly would like to get out of the house-to-house fighting in Gaza if they can.
And as of right now, they have the ceasefire, but like I said, we don't know how long that's going to last.
I don't know how long that's going to last, and I suspect it'll be a very fragile ceasefire.
So looking forward, what can we expect? Obviously, we've said maybe the ceasefire lasts, maybe it doesn't, but for the region, what can we expect?
So I think Israel is probably going to make a decision about striking Iran's nuclear program here in the next few weeks. They're never going to be weaker than they are right now. So that's a factor that's out there. I think Israel recognizes, and I think the United States does too, that now is the time actually to try to extract significant concessions from Iran. Concessions about the scope and scale of their nuclear program, concessions about their avowed policy of destruction of the state of Israel, concessions about their continued support for proxy forces across the region. If we are unable to bring effective pressure on Iran now and cause their course to change, then we're never going to be able to do it. The Trump administration has a remarkable opportunity here, brought about by actions that really occurred during the first Trump administration that have now come to fruition.
And that was part of the first administration, Trump administration's max pressure campaign on.
Well, it was the strike on Qasem Soleimani. It was the signing of the Abraham Accords, and it was the decision to bring Israel into the Central Command region. Taken together, those 3 actions have created a powerful collective framework for further action against Iran right now with the other states in the region.
How long do you think we have for that opportunity to be able to pressure them? And
it's measured in months, not weeks, months, maybe a year or 2, not longer than that.
Okay, well then I guess the administration should get some policy people on it.
I believe they're very much aware of that, Ted.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, General.
Thanks, Ted.
And that's going to wrap up another episode of What's Really Happening. We held an intriguing discussion with GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, as we talked about the current situation in Israel. As always, I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute. We thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to our next episode when we find out what's really happening.